Hello, and welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folktales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, and I am reporting live. What a wild year that it's been, and how disappointing it is that people in Palestine are still being murdered. I think it's horrible. We've said it on this podcast before, but I think it should be said again. No human being on this planet should be denied safety, fresh water, food, love. I don't really care what the excuse is. I am never going to support a genocide. I really don't care. I really don't care what the argument is. Genocide is not cool with me. And that applies to every single demographic of people, every single expression of a culture, a personality trait, a sexuality, a skin color, a religion. I really don't care. No one should be genocided, point blank, period. And I am so sad. I am so disappointed to live at a time where humans claim to be quote unquote modern. They claim to be educated. They claim to be advanced. They claim to have some kind of understanding, advanced understanding of how the world works and technology and bettering society. I cannot buy into this fantasy while we are murdering each other for reasons that some people seem to think are justified. It's silly, it's childish, and it's unacceptable. So, I think that needed to be said, and I will be happy to repeat that as many times as we need to hear it. Oftentimes, we do well with repetition. We're monkeys, after all. I'm having some ice cold sandia juice, some watermelon. It's so good. I also want to mention that this year, I feel like a lot of people have been dying outside of the context of war and genocide. Like a lot of people have just been passing away in general, or at least people in my circles within the last 12 months. I just, so many people I know and friends of friends and friends' family members, some of my family members, so many people have passed away. And I've been reflecting a lot on this because it is snake year. It is the year of the snake. And the year of the snake is really all about reflection. And from what I understand, the snake sheds its skin and then lays eggs. And so in the Chinese zodiac, this year really is about rebirth and eventually like laying an egg, like creating a new version of oneself or of reality, perhaps. And so I do think that it's really symbolic. So many people have been passing away because beyond people passing away, I also think there is just a giant rebirth happening, both literally and allegorically. And so I just really wanted to take a second to pay respect and send a blessing to every single being, be it human, animal, extraterrestrial, any kind of being who has been reborn and passed into the other realms. I would love to send you all a blessing. And I would like to send a blessing to every conscious and living thing. Love is the best thing that we have, and sharing love with each other is kind of the secret of how this all works. So I love you. Whoever's listening to this, I love you. And speaking of snakes, we're going to talk about snakes today, babe. We're going to talk all about snakes. Okay, well, let's be clear. Snakes is a huge category, and there's so much to talk about. But specifically today, I want to talk about serpents, primordial serpents, leviathans, creator spirits. I've noticed that almost over the whole planet, there are creation myths that involve serpents, and I find that to be very interesting. Why is that? And and as time has passed in our human civilization, our experience and opinion of the snake has changed greatly, and I have some theories as to why. So let's get into it, babe. Buckle up. I bring you primordial serpents. Slytherin. Except you're toast, JK, sorry. You're toast. We don't fuck with you. Okay. Beneath the waters, coiled in the shadows, there's always a serpent. From Mesopotamia to the Bible, from Mesoamerica to the Far East, serpents have been keepers of wisdom, chaos burners. Oops, chaos bringers. Chaos burners work. Bringers of chaos, and sometimes gods themselves. This is primordial serpents, leviathans, etc. Let's get into it. So, let's first talk about one of the OG stories, one of the OG serpent myths. This is Tiamat. Tiamat is a Mesopotamian primordial chaos dragon slash serpent. She was a saltwater queen. She was always depicted as female, depicted as anthropomorphic, but almost always she was depicted with breasts and a tail. Love. She is known to birth the first generations of deities after mingling with her consort Abzu. And Abzu is a deity of the groundwater. So these are two water spirits birthing other deities. And their offspring, who are these deities, were known to be incredibly loud and noisy, which very much pissed off their parents. Now, this is kind of reminding me of the Titans in Greek mythology. Am I right? Yes, of course I am. Also, what's kind of crazy is that some of their grandchildren, some of Tiamat's grandchildren, are considered to be Anu and Ki. If you don't know, according to the Mesopotamian history, and I want to be very clear, when you research some of this, they will sometimes refer to the Anunnaki as a part of the Mesopotamian religion. However, in Mesopotamian culture, they did not have a word for religion, so they considered this to be their history. And they had stories of beings who came down from the sky and essentially colonized them, taught them language, taught them mathematics, gave them technology, etc., etc. These people they called the Anunnaki, and they lived on a giant planet, which they called Nibiru, that would rotate around, it would orbit around our solar system, etc., etc. And the head, the king of this race of beings was known as Anu. So, according to this creation myth, Tiamat, this primordial saltwater goddess, is the grandmother of Anu, fascinating, and Ki, who is the goddess of earth. And there you have Anunnaki. Okay, so according to this myth, the children of Absu and Tiamat are very loud. They're very entitled. Absu is driven mad by the noise. He can't take it. And in a violent rage, he gets himself killed. And so, of course, Tiamat is incredibly upset. This is her boo. This is her bae. She will not stand. So she wages war on the demigods. She takes on a new consort by the name of Kingu, and she bestows upon him the tablet of destinies. And this is essentially a declaration of divine rulership. This is also kind of giving the divine covenant. This is a thing in other cultures as well. And in China, they have a similar story where the dragon of the east bestows upon the king the right to be the ruler. And according to their history, this tablet of destinies would be passed on from king to king throughout the Mesopotamian society. So eventually, our girl Tiamat is slain by Marduk. Marduk is in the Anunnaki pantheon, and he is the son of Enki, which, okay, let's see. Enki is one of the sons of Anu. He is considered to be a bastard son. He is associated with the sign Capricorn. This goat mermaid situation is the symbol of Enki. He's also Poseidon. And he was banished to the ocean by his brother Enlil, who was the legitimate son of Anu. Is this too much info? Maybe it's too much info. But if Enki is the son of Anu, and Anu is the grandson of Tiamat, this would make Marduk the great grandson of Tiamat. So he slays Tiamat, and according to their history, the body of Tiamat became the heavens and the earth. How beautiful is that? So, according to their history, the earth and the heavens are made out of the body of this giant primordial female serpent with large breasts. Love her. I also think this is interesting because there's a lot of crossovers with biblical moments, and we're going to touch on that in just a second. What I also find fascinating is in Mesopotamian culture, snakes were believed to be immortal because they could infinitely shed their skin and be reborn. So they believed that snakes were immortal beings. Also, in the Sumerian culture, they worshipped a deity known as Ningishzida, the god of vegetation and the underworld, war, and snakes. It is believed that Ningishzida believed to spend part of the year on the land and part of the year in the land of the dead. Also, before the arrival of the Israelites, snake cults were incredibly popular and widely established in the Canaanite cultures during the Bronze Age. Think about that. There are snake cults all around the ancient world. Let that sink in, babe. Snake cults in ancient cities in Syria all the way to Babylon. So this is a huge, huge area from ancient Syria all the way to Babylon, which is modern day Baghdad. Archaeologists have found bronze statues of gods holding bronze snakes and of singular bronze snakes flanked over doorways of temples. Get out of here. So it's pretty obvious that snakes are a big deal in the ancient world. Obviously and sadly, a lot of nuance and details from Mesopotamian and Sumerian culture are lost on us because so much time has passed, and arguably because throughout colonization, people destroy so many relics due to bigotry. But I do want to talk about the crossovers of Tiamat to the Leviathan, which is mentioned in the Bible. What I do also want to mention is that the Bible obviously are these ancient stories, but a lot of these elements and themes in the Bible weren't created out of thin air. Even the stories of, let's say, Moses or Abraham or even Jesus, sure, those may have been contemporary stories, but cultural context and possibly even older stories in the Bible could have already been thousands of years old, or culturally had been marinating for thousands of years, right? And I just like really want that to sink in, because I think it's really hard for us as humans in the present day to contextualize and understand how beliefs can shift very quickly, and how an image or a concept for perhaps for thousands of years could have meant something incredibly sacred and holy, and then over the course of a couple decades could be demonized. And I just really want you to like think about that as we're learning about these serpents, because in my opinion, it's very clear that in the ancient world, serpents were considered magical and special. And I feel like because of possibly mostly the Christian church, serpents started becoming demonized, and there's just like there's a lot of layers to go through. So let's get into it. Okay. So in the Hebrew tradition and biblical traditions, they talk of a Leviathan. The Leviathan is a monstrous sea serpent mentioned in the book of Job, the book of Psalms, and the book of Isaiah. She is known as a chaos monster who's eventually subdued by Yahweh. It is thought that the world comes, oh, my bad. It is thought that the word Leviathan derives from the term in Hebrew, which means wreathed and twisted in folds, which is like describing the physicality of the creature. Interestingly, the Leviathan is almost always described as a female, but there are some versions and translations of the Bible that talk about there being a male and female, and the male was eventually killed. So usually when people say Leviathan, they're talking about a she serpent monster. She is described usually as some kind of serpent dragon who lives deep in the ocean. Um, Her partner is often called a behemoth. This is like the most common translation. And the behemoth is not a leviathan, it's a different species. The behemoth basically translates into great beast. And a lot of um, a lot of historians believe that the word behemoth could derive from ancient Egyptian words that referred to water ox, or in some contexts, hippos. So the behemoth is like this male giant, formidable creature, right? Interestingly, the Leviathan was often described to possess illuminating power, specifically in her eyes. And she would be known to be able to create light and heat. Oh, isn't that fascinating? According to most scriptures, God decided that Leviathans would overpopulate the earth, which is why he ended up slaying the female Leviathan and will save her flesh and serve her as a feast for the righteous on the advent of the Messiah. What? Let's take a break. Hello, traveler. Have you forgotten that you are an incredible, one of a kind pepper? There is no one on planet Earth like you. Do you know how incredible that is? Never forget it. It might take time, it might take practice, but whatever your dreams are, you can attain them. Yes, you can, and you know that it's true. I believe in you. I'm so proud of you. One step at a time, and you're gonna make it. And we're back, darling. I think it's very, I like want to take a second and dissect this sentiment that according to the Bible, the righteous would eat the flesh of the Leviathan. Because, in my opinion, I do think that a lot of ancient and religious slash spiritual text is deeply coded with poetic allegory. So perhaps the snake, this primordial energy, this primordial force, would be accessible to the righteous. And perhaps it is a symbol of not only connecting with earth, but connecting with enlightenment, with the most ancient, feminine, formidable force there is. Now, I also like, there's even more to discuss, so let's talk about it because this shit is pretty crazy. Specifically, in one of the Talmuds, they describe the skin of the Leviathan being used to cover a tent where the banquet of the righteous would take place. So, at this banquet of the righteous, during the advent of the Messiah, quote, you would not only be feasting on the flesh of this giant serpent, but you will also be shaded by its skin. Lovely. The remaining skin would be used to cover the walls of Jerusalem, thereby illuminating the world with its brightness. How interesting is that, though? I'm not hearing anything about this that is condemning the beast, right? Like, I get that people, humans, are intimidated by its power, and perhaps even Yahweh is intimidated by the power of the Leviathan. But if you're going to eat it and be shaded by it, and then use its skin to illuminate your holy city, don't then we would love the Leviathan, right? I think we love her. I rest my case. Interesting, another interesting fun fact that in the Zohar, which is some of the foundational writings of the Kabbalah, which is the book of Jewish mysticism, which really derives from Egyptian mysticism that Moses shared with the Israelites. The Zohar refers to the Leviathan as a metaphor for enlightenment. They consider the image of the righteous eating the flesh of the Leviathan at this banquet was considered to be a metaphor for absorbing the light of the soul and achieving enlightenment. Some Jewish rabbis and scholars have likened the Leviathan to the Ouroboros and describe it having no mate and having its tail placed in its mouth, twisting around and encompassing the entire world. I find this also very interesting. We're going to get to that in a second, but a lot of cultures have a similar image of an Ouroboros, a serpent or snake eating its own tail, encompassing the world. I do find this really fascinating. It's a symbol of life and death, rebirth, regeneration. But I also think it's so fascinating that growing up, I wasn't religious, but when I would hear the term Leviathan, I feel like it was often associated with like primordial evil or like darkness. And there's really no evidence to support that. And I would argue that a lot of that comes from the interpretation of the snake from Genesis, which I also think is a misinterpretation. And I will get to that theory. So bear with me. The serpent in Eden, who is not considered to be a Leviathan, this is like a regular serpent, right? Often is interpreted as a symbol of temptation, wisdom, rebellion, and of course, by many Christians, the serpent is associated with the devil. Because of this Christian idea of serpents being the devil, a lot of Christian interpretations taint most serpents to be symbols of endangering God's power and being agents of chaos. Interestingly, in the Old Testament, there are never inti there are never anything that identifies the Leviathan with the devil. But in the New Testament, it is explicitly described as a seven-headed dragon and an enaction of the devil. See? Ugh, I need to have a sip of my juice. I think this is so crucial. This is something maybe I should do a deep dive one day, like comparing Christian interpretations of the Old Testament. Because where does this come from? Like, where do all these demonizations come from? And I have a theory. Really, my theory is, as we know, if you haven't listened to my episode number 2, which is about Coptic Christianity, highly recommend. But essentially, Christianity really caught on after Jesus died. And in the first 1,000 years, from basically year 0 up to the year 1000, so many people were converting to Christianity. So many. And at this point in time, in general, most religions were oral traditions. And so within the ancient world, people started having their own versions of the Bible. Some of the oldest Bibles known to man have been found in Greece, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Also, though, honorable mention to Armenia, which was the first country to make Christianity their official religion, and Turkey, of course. Um, Modern day Turkey was one of the first cities to host a worldwide debate about Christianity. Now, I'm going to be staying on topic here, but essentially, around the year 700, don't quote me on that, the Roman Empire realized that their empire was so big and they really didn't have the respect of most of their subjects because most of their subjects were foreigners from these faraway lands who had no respect for Rome because Rome were horrible colonizers. So they recognized that even while being colonized, people were still so proudly paying tribute to Christianity. They even noticed that for a while in Egypt, the local Egyptians were practicing Christianity while they still had to pay a tax to the Arab Caliphate for being Christian. And they were dealing with all kinds of prejudice by being Christian, and they still chose to do it proudly. And so, of course, Rome recognized this opportunity. At this point in the Christian world, one of the highest ranking priests was known as the See of Alexandria. He was a priest of the city of Alexandria that many Christians would refer to for guidance and or interpreting the Bible. Rome decided to appoint a See of Rome, and the See of Rome is now called the Pope, and now the Pope is considered to be the highest ranking clergyman of the whole Christian world, blah, blah, blah. So, with this idea of using a religion to colonize people, using a religion to colonize their beliefs, to then colonize their country, their culture, their economy, everything, also came this idea of demonizing all things that predates Christianity, which they called pagan, right? So I think, and I wanted to say this now because like I feel like there's so much darkness and judgment that is cast upon snakes that in my opinion, comes from Rome co-opting and colonizing Christianity and demonizing all things ancient. Also, and one thing I want to bring up, which I find fascinating, that in the Gnostic tradition is kind of a branch of Christianity, and they call themselves Gnostic because the word gnosis, which is a Greek word, means knowledge. They have really interesting hot takes on the Bible. And in the Gnostic tradition, they see the Leviathan as an Ouroboros that separates the truest reality into the distorted and physical material world. And eventually, when one dies, they must pass through the 7 layers of heaven or they will be consumed by the Leviathan. Ooh, isn't that fascinating? And get this, according to Gnosticism, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is not referred to as Leviathan, but often associated with the Leviathan. They describe the serpent in the Garden of Eden as a deceptive creature by promoting Eve to eat the apple that God had forbidden. But what I think is so fascinating is that according to the Gnostic tradition, they see a distinction between the truest God and the demiurge. And essentially what this means is that a demiurge is like a false god. Maybe not quite a false god. It's like a demigod. And so according to the Gnostics, in the Bible, the God that is often referred to is only the creator of the material world, whereas the real, truest God cannot be named. And so the serpent actually is a teacher, a symbol of wisdom by telling Eve to eat the apple, by telling Eve to eat from the apple from the tree of knowledge. Interestingly, too, in the Bible, they discuss that part of why God ends up banishing Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden is so that they didn't eat from the tree of life and gain immortality. Yes, I do think this is really interesting. Like, especially when I read the Bible, it feels very colonizer coded. It feels very, if there was a God, if the God from the Bible existed, which they claim is all loving, all accepting, all forgiving, this idea of banishing and punishing like doesn't really fit into me. And so I do kind of like this Gnostic concept of there being this demigod that essentially is like us. He has an ego. He is a being with faults and is limited versus him being the truest creator of all things, right? Interestingly and non-surprisingly, a lot of clergymen in Christianity see the serpent as an allegory for sexual desire. Also, this is fascinating. In the Hebrew language, the word for snake is often Nāgas. Nāgas? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Nāgas. It is possible that this word Nāgas derives from a word meaning luminous or shining one. This is also an interesting tie-in because in the story of Moses, Moses recognizes the call of God to lead the Israelites out of slavery. And he anticipated that the Israelites would doubt his divine calling. And so Moses asks God for a sign. God tells him to cast his rod that he carried onto the ground. And as he did that, his rod turned into a snake. Moses ran from the snake, but God told him to take it by the tail. And as he did, his rod turned back into a rod. The snake turned back into a rod. Also, later in the book of Exodus, Moses' staff and Aaron's staff turn into snakes again. And in the book of Numbers, Moses is described in the wilderness. He mounts a serpent of bronze on a pole that functioned as a cure against the bite of the seraphim, which was a venomous snake. This is also just so fascinating to me because none of these connote an evil serpent. These all seem to be symbols of being the Messiah. Am I right or am I right? And again, I do think that it's very telling that in the Hebrew tradition and in the Gnostic tradition, there is no indication that any kind of serpent is evil. This does feel like the work of the Christian church demonizing all things, quote, pagan. You feel me? My one last little note is that I mentioned that Gnosticism made a distinction between the real creator of the universe and the demiurge. But I also wanted to mention that according to the Gnostic tradition, The serpent symbolizes a distinction between the unknowable God, the builder of all reality, versus the demiurge, who is the creator of our material world. And they see the story of the serpent in Eden as a symbol for the eternal conflict between good and evil, and the conception of the serpent as the liberation savior and bestower of knowledge. Fascinatingly, in the book Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda talks about his mentor, who is named Sri Yukteswar. And in one part of the book, Sri Yukteswar is talking about the Bible, and he actually talks about the Garden of Eden story. One thing that I really loved about spending time in India and talking to people in India, um, was this really like lovely and casual belief that Christianity is really just Hinduism. It's really sweet. I loved in India almost everyone I chatted to talked about how every major religion was actually Hinduism and they didn't know it. And that, of course, every story that you could think of from every single scripture is actually just Hinduism that's misinterpreted. So anyway, Sri Yukteswar talks about the Garden of Eden and talks about it actually being a story from Hinduism that had been changed through the centuries, kind of like a game of telephone, and completely misinterpreted. And so what Sri Yukteswar said is that animals are always allies because they are a part of nature and they do not lie, according to him. So he was saying that any time in life or in a scripture, it doesn't matter what the religion, if there is an animal, it is always an ally, always. And essentially, the snake was an allegory for the Kundalini energy, which is this like primordial, eternal energy that lives in the base of our spine. That what enlightenment really is unlocking this energy on the base of your spine and allowing it to uncoil out of the top of your head, having this energy, this luminous light extend from the base of your spine up through your spine and up out of the top of your head. And this is their symbol of enlightenment, and the snake is the symbol of said enlightenment. And so according to Sri Yukteswar, this story of Adam and Eve is an allegory for the woman, the intuitive, creative part of humanity, listening to her own intuition, listening to the snake at the base of her spine, her intuition telling her to take a bite from the tree of knowledge. And by doing so, allowing her soul, with knowledge, with the food of knowledge, her soul can expand. And then, of course, Adam, who is the logical masculine version of humanity, follows her. And in doing so, they reach full enlightenment. And then being banished from the garden was actually being cast away from the garden of disillusion of Maya, which in the Hindu tradition is essentially the physical world, illusions. And I really, really love that interpretation. And just for me personally, it feels more accurate. I, I, that is something that I think I have the most fascination with. I think that every single religious scripture is fascinating and worth reading. But I think what puzzles me is how the interpretations are so homogenous and often I often find that people's interpretations could stem back to medieval Europe. And if you are clinging to an interpretation of any scripture that is from medieval Europe, like maybe you need to rethink your life. Because what were they doing right in medieval Europe? Nothing. Like, sorry, babe, nothing. Ah, uh, and with that, let's keep it pushing. There's so much to cover. So, next up, we have Egypt. Egypt also has a story of a primordial serpent. Surprise, surprise. Here we have Apophis, also sometimes known as a pep. A pep, a little pepper. We'll just go with Apophis because if I keep saying a pep, I will be way too distracted. I'm not professional. I'm not that professional. So Apophis is known as the giant serpent of chaos, a deity of the underworld, embodies darkness and disorder, described as being 16 yards long, which is about 16 meters long, with the head made of flint, which is like that stone, right, that you would use to make sparks. Um, one thing though I do think is interesting that I do want to say really quick is that like darkness and disorder, I think we associate with evil, but this is giving me Scorpio vibes. Like sometimes the underworld and darkness and chaos isn't necessarily evil. You know what I'm saying? That's like what creation is. Creation comes out of the world of nothingness, and then as it materializes, it finds order. So I just see it as like a part of the divine cycle of all reality, right? That's just me. Okay. So Apophis, this primordial serpent, is known as the opponent of light and the goddess Ma'at, who is the goddess of order and truth. And Apophis is the opponent of Ra, the sun deity. The story is that Apophis attacks Ra's solar chariot each night. And so he's known to wait in the horizon of the far west so that he can attack Ra after sunset, and they battle all night long. And that is why they sometimes refer to Apophis as the world circler, which is kind of reminding me of the Ouroboros. Some depictions of Apophis are of him being evil. Okay, I said it, fine. A lot of priests in ancient Egypt believed that they had to have a certain amount of priests each night praying to help ensure that Ra would win his nightly battle and that the sun would rise again the next morning. Also, pharaohs were often depicted spearing serpents, which reinforced this cosmic kinship to Ra and the sun god. Also, honorable mention that Ouroboroses were often engraved in shrines and tombs of some of the pharaohs, including our boy Tutankhamun. Just saying. Then in Greece, we also have stories of primordial serpents. There is the story of a python who was a giant serpent and was believed to protect the navel of planet Earth, which they basically considered the center of planet Earth, which happened to be Delphi and the oracle tree. In ancient Greece, they believed that the oracle tree sat on the exact center of planet Earth, and that this primordial python protected it. This is also kind of giving Kundalini energy, am I right? The python was considered to be a child of Gaia, who is Mother Earth. Later, the python became the enemy of Apollo, who is the god of the sun. This is really giving Ra and Apophis. And eventually, Apollo slayed the python at the tree of Delphi. And the site, Delphi and the oracle tree, became a part of the kingdom of Apollo. Fascinating. Also, all over Greece, they have depictions of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. They often associate it with the symbol of eternity, infinity, cycles, and rebirth. Ouroboros is also actually a Greek word. It literally translates into tail eater. And the Ouroboros is depicted in Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, the Ouroboros appears as the serpent Jormungandr, one of the three children of Loki and Angrboda. Their children grew so large, and specifically the serpent, the Ouroboros, grew so large that it can encircle the world and grasp its tail in its teeth. In the legends of Ragnar Lodbrok, the great king Herod gives a small lindworm as a gift to his daughter Pora, after which it grows into a large serpent which encircles the girl's bower and bites itself in the tail. The serpent is eventually slain by Ragnar, who marries Pora, and Ragnar later has a son with another woman named Kraka. Sorry, that name got me. And his son was born with the image of the white snake in one eye. This snake encircled the iris and bit itself in the tail, and the son was named Sigurd, snake in the eye. Ooh, so enigmatic. Like, what are, it's just so fascinating to me that these symbols reoccur in all these cultures. However, another honorable mention, though, in Greece is, of course, the staff of Asclepius. This is the symbol that we all know and we see to this day in a lot of pharmacies, hospitals, the symbol of a staff with a snake intertwined around it. This comes from the healing cult of Asclepius. Asclepius was a deity in the Greek pantheon, and his symbol was a staff with a snake wrapped around it. A big idea of why this was his symbol was because the snake itself, with its shedding skin, was a symbol of rejuvenation and possibly healing yourself. However, a lot of other people believe as well that the staff and the snake together symbolize the dual nature of life, death, sickness, and health. Another honorable mention in the theory is that in ancient Greek society, the term pharmakon, which of course you hear pharma in there, meant both drug or medicine and poison. Interesting. So the snake was a symbol of that power, of being both able to heal, but also having the ability to poison. Some believe that the staff of Asclepius was a symbol of magical healing, much like a wizard's staff. Interestingly, because the snake was associated with Asclepius, a non-venomous rat-eating snake was allowed to crawl freely on the floors of his temples, which were essentially dormitories for the sick. So this breed of snake, sometimes there'd be like many, would just be allowed to like roam around the hospital. But they would eat rats. So I feel like this is for the best because as they eat rats, vermin carry disease. I mean, we don't hear about the bubonic plague in ancient Greece, am I right? And now we get to our big boys, ancient India. Of course, the primordial serpent of ancient India is known as the Naga. I have talked about the Nāgas a little bit before, so I'm not going to go as super deep on a deep dive, but the Nāgas are a semi-divine serpent being. They're the guardians of treasures and cosmic waters. They're both dangerous and benevolent. Also, a really big honorable mention is that in many stories of the Buddha reaching enlightenment, there is a tale that Buddha reaches enlightenment before a 13-day storm, I believe, and the king of Nāgas, the Nagaraja, comes from the underworld and creates a canopy with all of his heads for the Buddha to stay warm and dry. Interestingly, as well, according to the Indian tradition, the Nāgas used to rule the earth and then eventually were banished into the underworld. Like, there is something going on here. You know what I'm saying? All of these cultures have stories about these incredibly huge serpent, dragon-like creatures which once ruled the earth and are now living in the underworld. And then, of course, we have the Kundalini serpent. And mentioned it being the snake coiled at the base of the spine. And this has been mentioned in the Aitareya Brahmana. Sorry about my pronunciation, guys. This is a Vedic text that goes back to as early as the first millennium BC. The nature of the Vedic rituals is compared to a snake biting its own tail. Ouroboros symbolism has been used to describe the Kundalini. According to medieval yoga Kundalini, the divine power, Kundalini, shines like the stem of a young lotus. Like a snake coiled round upon herself, she holds her tail in her mouth and lies resting half asleep as the base of the body. Also, some Hindu scholars use the Ouroboros image as a reference to the cycle of samsara, which is the cycle of rebirth until you finally can reach enlightenment. This is pretty deep. Next, we're going to talk about China, babe. In ancient China, they obviously have huge mega stories about serpents, really specifically dragons. But in a lot of depictions of the Chinese dragons, they really are more serpent-like. They have these dragon heads, but they have these long, slithering, lanky bodies. They consider dragons to be benevolent. They're incredibly long, and they often have no wings. So this is giving serpent. They embody cosmic harmony and control over rain, rivers, and fertility of the land. Farmers performed dragon serpent rituals to ensure that their crops would grow. There was even dragon kings, mythic serpent-like rulers of the seas. Each ocean, lake, or river could have its own dragon king, often worshipped in temples. For example, fishermen prayed to these serpent dragon deities for safety and good harvest from the south. Oh, from the sea. Of course, there's also the yellow dragon, which is considered to be the father of all emperors in China and the first emperor. He came down from the sky and incarnated and bestowed the title of emperor upon the human race, which is also reminding me of Tiamat. Am I right? I am right. Also, honorable mention to Nuwa, who I've never heard of, who's actually a serpent-bodied goddess in the Chinese tradition. Nuwa is a creator deity with a human torso and a serpent body. She patched the sky with colored stones after cosmic catastrophe. She is associated with order, rebirth, and balance, again echoing serpent as life and restorer. The serpent dragon in China fuses earthly fertility with heavenly balance, this yin and yang principle. It represents the liminal bridge between chaos and harmony. Hey, little Pepper. This is Annabelle here, reporting live from Pepper World HQ. If you enjoy the podcast, it would help so much if you could follow me. You could write a comment, give me 5 stars perhaps. Also, I would love to hear from you. Email in at esotericanonnonsense@gmail.com. I'd love to hear about your stories. I'd love to hear about suggestions. I would love to hear about any kind of weird, freaky thing that comes to your mind. Also, if you would like to support my podcast, you can follow me on Patreon. It's Patreon.com/Esoterica and Nonsense. I will also have a YouTube page coming at you so soon. And I also sell merch. You can look up my merch. It's in the show notes for every single episode, as well as the show notes for my show. I appreciate you so much. I made this podcast to connect with cool, freaky people like you. So thank you so much. Yeah, babe. Next up, I want to get into Mesoamerica. This shit is so fucking cool. In the Aztec and slash Mexica tradition, there are stories of Quetzalcoatl. And in the Mayan tradition, there is Kukulkan. What I find fascinating though, and like this is just, I think this is true for like all ancient culture, is like when I'm doing a lot of this research, I see these distinctions being made, like, oh, Quetzalcoatl is from the Aztec slash Mexica tradition. However, quetzales, which are birds, are like all over the Mayan world. It's like the symbol of like the Mayan culture. And I have heard when I spent time in Guatemala, people talking about Quetzalcoatl. So I'm not an expert on this. I'm just doing raw research. And I just want to remind everyone that a lot of these sources are they are written by white men who really don't know anything. And that's why we're doing the investigation ourselves. We're putting pieces together. These white guys could never. You know what I'm saying? But basically, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulyakan are very similar deities, and some argue is the same deity with a different name from different cultures. He is known as the feathered serpent and one of the most important gods of the Americas. He symbolizes the union of earth, the serpent, and sky, feathers, associated with Venus, the morning star, and the cycles of resurrection and cosmic order. Myths say that he descended to the underworld to retrieve bones from the past worlds, sprinkling them with his own blood to create humanity. The story goes something like this. Long, long ago, when the world was young, the gods gathered in Teotihuacan, the city of gods. Humanity had perished in a great destruction, and the world was barren. But the gods decided mankind should be reborn. The task fell to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, lord of wind, knowledge, and creation, to bring forth life again. He had to journey into the underworld, Mictlan, ruled by Mictlantecuhtli and Mictecuatl. I'm doing my best. The skeletal lord and lady of death. Quetzalcoatl descended through the 9 levels of Mictlan, where shadows pressed in and winds carried the cries of the dead. At the deepest layer, he found the gods of death, who guarded the bones of the previous creations of mankind. Mictlantecuhtli spoke. If you can sound this conch, you may take the bones, but the conch is hollow and silent as death. Quetzalcoatl accepted. He called upon the worms of the earth and bore holes in the shell, and then the bees to swarm inside, buzzing until the conch sounded. The death gods, tricked, handed him the bones, but they set traps along the path. As Quetzalcoatl fled upwards, he stumbled. The bones fell and shattered, scattering across the underworld floor. Desperate, he gathered what fragments he could, carrying them back to the light of the world above. Once he returned, Quetzalcoatl placed the bones in a sacred bundle. He bled onto them, giving his own essence to the bones. From the union of divine blood and ancient bone, humanity was reborn, fragile, broken, but alive. And so the Mexica explained why humans come into many sizes and shapes. We are made of mismatched bones, given life by the blood of the feathered serpent. Beautiful. Also, it is said that many of the pyramids around the ancient world in both the Aztec and Mayan traditions, such as Chichen Itza, the Temple of Kukulyakan, were built to align with the equinoxes and the solstices, creating the illusion of the giant serpent of light sliding down the stairs. I also think it's an honorable mention to talk about the story that the Mexica had about the creation of what is now Mexico City. There was a legend as they were nomadic that there would be a place that they would eventually settle. And according to their prophecy, that the place that they would eventually settle would show itself when they saw an eagle attacking a snake on a San Pedro cactus. And so, as the legend goes, for centuries, this tribe of people were nomadic, moving from place to place, and eventually on this island in this beautiful lake next to a volcano, they saw an eagle attacking a snake on the San Pedro cactus. And then, of course, this is where they decided to settle. This became their capital, which is now known as Mexico City, La Ciudad de Mexico. Also, if you haven't seen, the Mexican flag also has this symbol of the eagle attacking the snake. And I do think that is really interesting. I think like using the lens of all the ancient cultures with this, it does kind of feel like this idea of like the heavens, the sky triumphing over the earth. I also feel like it's kind of this idea, if you will, of enlightenment, because as the snake is being eaten and absorbed by the eagle, it is then moving into the sky. It is going from the ground into the sky. And then, of course, the San Pedro cactus. I mean, you're going to trip balls. So to me, it does kind of feel like another allegory, yet again, of enlightenment. But that's just me. What do you think? Email in, babe. Tell me your thoughts. Also, unsurprisingly, the natives of North America also have some stories about some serpents. Also, I just want to say, if I am just butchering this because I'm doing my research online and you know these stories better than me, please email in. I would love to hear about you. That is the whole point of this podcast. I want to create a community of beautiful, magical people, and I want to hear your stories. I want to tell the stories that you heard growing up. To educate me, babe. I'm tired of these white guys writing the history, please. So, in the North American traditions, there is a primordial snake known as the Great Serpent. And this is a widespread concept. Specifically among the Cherokee, they talk of the horned serpent known as the Uktena. It is a giant snake with crystal in its forehead that could grant visions and powers. Hunters sought to find it at great risk. In the Ojibwe culture, they describe the underwater serpent Mishipeshu, the guardian of lakes, associated with storms and powerful medicine. There is an episode where I talk about Mishipeshu, and I don't know which episode it is, but get lost in these episodes, Dad. Also, in the Hopi traditions, they tell of serpent deities connected with underground waters, initiation ceremonies, and spirits. Serpents appear in ceremonies as guardians of water and as power, often feared but also revered as teachers. Mm. And I also like think because they're almost always associated with water, and water is a symbol of emotions and femininity, and they're often, again, serpents are often associated with the creation of the universe. This is like giving feminine energy. It's giving the feminine, primal, fearsome power. Just saying. Also, in the South American traditions, there are tons of mentions of primordial serpents. Fun fact, if you haven't seen it, go and watch Embrace of the Serpent. It is the best film ever made. It will change your life. Please watch that film. However, in the ancient Incan tradition, they have tales of Amaru. Amaru is a double-headed serpent with one head pointing to the heavens and one to the underworld. Amaru is a symbol of liminality, the bridging of cosmic realms. In a lot of Incan art, the serpent Amaru appears in textiles and carvings associated with magical slash some shamanic journeys. A lot of practitioners of magic invoked serpents during ritual drinking of ayahuasca, where serpents often appear as guiding or devouring vision. Serpents embody the transformation through death and rebirth, journeying between worlds and acquiring wisdom. In some Amazonian tribes, they have stories of the universe having been created by a anaconda, and the giant anaconda being the mother of the universe. Interestingly, and I think without question, across cultures, serpents embody the liminal space, earth, water, trees, and being able to move between realms, arguably some feminine energy. Humans everywhere evolved with instinctive snake fear. This is a primal template, as they call it, a fear of snakes to be able to, because they, you know, are formidable and they're terrifying. However, a lot of these myths transmute this fear of snakes into symbols of power and of wisdom, because they are. And I also think it's important to remember that not every culture, just because you feared something, doesn't make it bad. You can respect its power and perhaps even aspire to attain its power. Of course, there is this common theme of this hero slaying the agent of chaos, right? We see this in the symbol of the eagle attacking the snake. We see this in Ra attacking Apophis. We see this in Apollo killing the python. However, beyond all these stories, and almost arguably older than those stories, is the story of the serpent as a guardian of knowledge and a guardian of ancient wisdom. They're often depicted with infinity, the cosmic circle, and as a healer. And that's really kind of like my ultimate question. Like, when did this start happening as a human society? Because even though there are cultures that are separated by oceans and mountains, as humanity, we share a collective subconscious. We all are one. There is no individuality. And I do think it's really telling that a symbol that was often associated with enlightenment and power and primordial creation became demonized. I think that's something that we really need to examine. And in general, we just need to examine this idea that if something is dangerous or more powerful than us, it is something to be defeated. Like perhaps it's okay that we're not the apex predator. Like I feel like we need to I'm addressing just men, but this idea of being like the most powerful, why is that the goal? Like, what if as humans our real purpose is to be caretakers to the land, to appreciate the land, to fertilize the land, to care for the land? And if it's our time, if a snake decides to take us, like maybe it's the snake's prerogative. Maybe the snake really is an ally and knows what it's doing. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe I'm like getting a little bit too loose with this, but this is just an idea. Okay, now I do want to talk about some like modern, interesting, fun, left field concepts. As time has gone on, obviously, many people have had their own hot takes of these concepts. What are these ancient primordial serpents? What do they mean? And a theory by Thomas Hobbes, um, known as Leviathan, is something worth mentioning, and I find it very fascinating. Thomas Hobbes wrote in 1651 his quote masterpiece, we'll see about that, known as Leviathan. He borrowed its title and imagery from the biblical chaos serpent. Of course, we know all about the Leviathan, we're pros. Instead of him seeing the Leviathan as a sea monster threatening divine order, Hobbes envisioned the state itself being the political state as a Leviathan, an immense, almost monstrous body composed of its citizens. Essentially, he wrote this during the English Civil War between 1641 and 1651. This was a time of chaos, shifting power, and civil breakdown. He believed that without a strong central authority, that human life would descend into a quote, war of every man against every man, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he proposed that the Leviathan as a state. So bear with me. Basically, he described society as a social contract that people surrender to. They surrender certain freedoms to a sovereignty in exchange for security. It's giving fascism. The sovereign, which would be a monarch or a government, becomes the Leviathan, a massive artificial person whose body is composed of the individuals of said society. Basically, in his writings, there are illustrations of a Leviathan um, with a giant crowned figure, and its body is made of countless tiny humans looming over the land with sword and staff. Basically, he's proposing that the Leviathan, in essence, is a serpent of society, powerful, immense, and potentially terrifying, but necessary to hold back the chaos of human nature. Hobbes consciously invoked the biblical serpent to describe the government as a creature greater than any one man, binding chaos through overwhelming authority. I mean, I feel like this is kind of like a Freudian slip because, granted, I do, I'm kind of interpreting like the serpent as a symbol of enlightenment for sure. But I do think that it's really telling that like most Christians and modern society has demonized the snake, right? So like this is kind of like a deep idea, this idea of everyone coming together to create a thing larger than them, which I love and I do think is true. I don't believe in separateness. I do believe we're all one. But then he has to go and again appoint a quote sovereign, a monarch. So like this is kind of like in a weird way creating this like weird self-fulfilling prophecy that then society becomes this primordial chaos agent. He's saying that to avoid chaos we have to become a leviathan, but according to Christians the leviathan is a chaos agent. You know what I'm saying? So I have mixed feelings about this. I do think that as humanity, for us to be able to co-create symbiotically, we have to like align our consciousnesses. I think that will happen more through meditation and psychic connection. And when we can all do that, we realize that we don't really want to be murdering and killing. We want to be coexisting and co-creating. But I don't necessarily think that it makes sense to be aligning each other and becoming one to only appoint like a sovereign ruler. That seems incredibly silly to me and counterproductive. Don't you think? I think so. Oh, Thomas Hobbes. Oh, what will white men think of next?
Hi there. Did you know that humans are made mostly of water? Something like 80% or something? I don't remember the stats. But water's crucial, you guys. Water's crucial. Have you been drinking water today? I highly recommend. You can also add a little bit of like pink salt or Celtic salt or some nice like real salt to your water to help your electrolytes. You can do a cucumber infusion. You could add some mint in there, some chia seeds. Like I'm inviting you to be creative here, but I'm also here to remind you, drink your water, baby boy. Drink your water. Really helps with the function of the nervous system, the function of the bowels. We're talking optimal functioning here. Drink your water, baby.
All in all, I have to side with Sri Yukteswar on this. This idea that all animals are allies. All animals are creations, manifestations of nature, the truest nature, which derives from the creator of the universe. And that these symbols and these concepts, these primordial serpents, are symbols of power, of beauty, and of magic. I have trouble seeing them as symbols of evil, and I have trouble seeing them as an allegory for unifying to then appoint a king. I think Thomas Hobbes was close, but incredibly off. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning, that across cultures, serpents symbolize immortality and regeneration. They shed their skin only to return transformed. They embody the paradox of human existence, both fear and wisdom, chaos and order, death and rebirth. Perhaps the serpent never left the Garden of Eden. Perhaps it coils still within us, a guardian, a trickster, a healer, a destroyer, whispering secrets of transformation, daring us to shed our own skin and step into the unknown. Oh, how beautiful is that? Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you. And I would just love to leave you with this idea that it is easy when you fear something to deem it as evil. And what if something you feared was something you were supposed to learn from? I love you so much. I appreciate you. And I'll see you next time.